Chapter 51 of God's Fool by Maarten MAARTENS. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Koopstad cackles. Next morning all Koopstad awoke to the delightful horror of a home-brewed tragedy. The genuine article, not an important scrap in a corner of the newspapers about a massacre in Sicily or Spain, but the tangible, controllable, private property crime of their own, with the added stimulus of initials which everyone was soon able to decipher, and a "scene of the murder" which everybody could go and stare at from the outside. It was as different from the ordinary tales in the papers as going to the theatre is different from reading that there has been a performance in another town. By 10 o'clock on that Saturday morning, then, there was not a child in the city, excepting the babies under 3, but knew that the town councillor Hendrik Lossell had been murdered by his mad brother. It was a merciful dispensation that the day should be a half holiday. There were not police enough in Koopstad to keep order on the road outside the gate. There are never police enough in Koopstad. The clubs had already heard the news on the preceding night, and the ladies of Koopstad therefore were able to communicate it to the whole household before breakfast. There was but one source of supreme disappointment to all. It was that everybody seemed to have received the information simultaneously. Everybody wanted to tell the story, and there was nobody left to tell it to. There was not even the interest of speculating who could have done it, for everybody knew it was Elias. Still, the why remained, and the how, when, and where in all its 100 authentic, fancified, and falsified particulars. The few facts were spread, in special editions, over great services of "latest intelligence." There was nothing done in the city all day but a constant exchanging of scraps of detail which everybody had already read for himself, and happy indeed was the rare individual whose volunteered item of news was met with a "No, I hadn't seen that." Before nightfall fancy portraits of Elias came out and were sold in the streets at 2d. apiece. The feeling in Koopstad was not very violent against Elias, it was more regretful. It shook its head. If anything, it was stronger against the twin brothers Lossell, because they had been so stupid, so culpably stupid, you know. And nobody ever forgives anybody else's stupidity. The stupider I can make you out to be, the less stupid need I appear to myself. It is a game of see-saw, and in see-saw everybody likes to go up. You and I would have foreseen long ago what danger there lies in allowing madmen to go loose. The brothers Lossell had not foreseen this, or perhaps they had not chosen to foresee it. Koopstad looked wise. What was this about a sudden appeal for a curatorship which had cropped up unexpectedly after all these years? A strange story. Doubtless there was more behind. You could not be very angry with Hendrik because he was dead. So people spoke doubtfully of Hubert and eyed him askance as he drove rapidly, in deep mourning, with sullen, staring face, to the bureau of the public prosecutor. And then, late in the afternoon, came the news of the liquidation of the South Sumatra Tobacco Company. Its shares fell 500% in a couple of hours. Men offered them to each other in the streets. Commercial circles at once sought, though vainly, to connect this event with the murder. Every man of business was loud in denouncing the shameful conspiracy. They were loudest who had made the most money by it. Yet it had not been quite so successful as it ought to have been, some of the best informed whispered to each other. The Royal Sumatra Company, too anxious to make sure of its majority, had bought up far more shares than it required. 1 million of money had been wasted in that manner. 1 million is a large sum, even in florins. It was confidently asserted that, what with one thing and another, Hendrik Lossell would be found to be ruined. Perhaps he had killed himself, suggested solitary individuals who wanted to be original. The idea spread like wildfire. Its originators were much irritated to hear that the medical men declared it to be untenable. "Poor Cornelia," said somebody. But the somebody was in a minority of one, like Lot, for all the well-regulated minds of Koopstad understood clearly that if Hendrik was ruined, it was the result of the lady's living more expensively than her better-born neighbours, and, as Cornelia would doubtless be ruined as well as her dead husband, there was no reason why everybody should not now say so. Would Volderdoes Zonen go too? That was the foremost, the absorbing question. In how far was the great house responsible for its partner's private debts? Late at night, immense relief was experienced at the clubs by the news that one of the most trusted sub-chiefs had declared, speaking evidently for his master, that, although the dead man's liabilities were enormous, yet by far the greater part of the large fortune of the head of the firm had remained intact. No secret was made of Hendrik's misdoings. An arrangement would have to be come to with his creditors. But the house of Volderdoes Zonen was saved. With this declaration men had to be content. It was not possible to get speech of Hubert Lossell. He drove from his house to the Palais de Justice in Elias's carriage, and straight back again to his house. The interview with the criminal authorities lasted an hour and a half. Not a word of that interview reached the outer world. What would it not have given could it have guessed that Hubert had declared to the astonished officials that he was convinced of his brother Elias's innocence. These gentlemen, when they first heard him, looked at each other and smiled. "You'll find," said Hubert, "that there was another person who had every reason to desire Hendrik Lossell's death. As the nurse has already told you, the two brothers were not alone last night. Find out who was with them. That is the way to discover the murderer." "Whom do you suspect, Mynheer Lossell?" asked the public prosecutor. "Would you kindly excuse my postponing my answer to that question?" replied Hubert. And then, this new hint being given, the whole story gradually developed itself. The notary and his men were re-examined, and, after them, the servants of the house. The first batch could only repeat their previous statements, but with the servants this second investigation proved more successful. For John, who, loving his place and his outer conscience, had only remembered up till now the arrival of the three men who had accompanied Hendrik, began to recall another circumstance under the stress of questioning. Although expressly forbidden to do so, he had admitted another gentleman, who had rung and asked whether Mynheer Hendrik Lossell were there. The gentleman had insisted on being allowed to go upstairs unattended. He had tipped John, heavily. The footman had heard the other three coming downstairs a few minutes earlier. He had passed into the hall to let them out. They had driven away in Mynheer Lossell's carriage. When the other gentleman came, the carriage had not yet returned. John did not know the gentleman. "Ask him," burst out Hubert, "whether he was tall and thin." The man of law frowned. "I am coming to that," he said. "You must not interrupt, if you please, Mynheer Lossell. If you wish to say whom you suspect, I will gladly give you an opportunity of doing so." "Remove this man," replied Hubert. "I will." And as soon as the door had closed upon John, the merchant said hurriedly, "I suspect my brother's brother-in-law, the advocate Alers. Get his photograph from Mevrouw Lossell and you will see. He was concerned in commercial transactions with my brother. My brother was in possession of papers which the other was anxious to recover. It was to institute inquiries about this very subject that I unexpectedly went to Amsterdam yesterday afternoon." The photograph was procured, and John was confronted with it. He was asked whether he knew this gentleman. "Yes," he said. "It was the gentleman who had come last night." They arrested Alers that evening. But they managed to do so without Koopstad knowing of it, out of consideration for his family. For the widow, above all. He was supposed to have gone out of town for a day or two. On Monday a renewed attempt must be made to get some assistance from Elias. But that would almost certainly prove futile. However, fortunately, they hardly wanted it. The whole dénouement was working round plainly enough now. The authorities were astonished to remember how persistently they had suspected the poor harmless idiot. But Koopstad knew nothing of this sudden change, and the portraits of the murderer were hawked about under the yellow gaslights all that Saturday night, and everybody who had twopence to spare stopped and bought one. "I always thought it would prove to be Alers," said Hubert to his wife when he came home, jaded and sick, late in the evening. Well, it was destiny. We cannot complain. Elias is saved, and so is Volderdoes Zonen. And you and I and the children. They were a bad couple, both of them, Thomas and Hendrik. It was the best thing for Hendrik that he should die, if one comes to think of it. What said your Kingsley? You cannot take away human life, it is only the animal life you take away. Very often the best thing you can do for a poor creature is to put him out of the world, saying, we render you back to God, that he may give you a fresh chance in another world, as you have spoiled your chance in this one. It comes to that. Well, he is right. If Hendrik had lived a day longer, he would have ruined us all, and committed crimes which he has now been spared. He may be thankful to the man who killed him. God have mercy upon him and us, said Margaret. Amen, echoed Hubert with a groan. If there be a God, he added. All day long Johanna had striven in vain to rouse Elias from the silent despair in which he lay as one asleep yet dreaming. She had wept till she could weep no longer, she had prayed till the fountain of her prayers seemed to dry up. Not for one instant had she believed in her darling's guilt, but all her attempts to solve the mystery had hitherto proved fruitless. John was dumb in her presence, and secretly hoped all things would turn out well. Elias lay back in his chair, and, if he spoke at all, it was to curse himself and the day upon which he was born, and the misery of being more evil than all other sons of men. In a moment of maddest rage and hate he had slain his brother. Never again, through all the endless years, would Hendrik come back to Cornelia. But Jasje, implored Johanna, explain why. Why is it, my child, that you should have done so awful a thing? But you did not do it. He struck me, repeated Elias over and over again, and I struck him back and killed him. I was glad. But, my son, the knife. Where did you get the knife from? What knife? Said Elias, waking up as it were from his sleep. How did you kill Hendrik, do you think? Asked the old woman quickly, bending over him. He struck me, and I struck him again, and killed him, said Elias, falling back into his torpor. I was glad. Child, spelled Johanna unwarily in her excitement. What is the matter with you? Why do you tell these things? And the knife, then, in his back, through the heart? There was no knife in the sitting-room. The knife used had been taken from your supper plate in the passage. Had you gone out to get it? You know you had not. She spelled it all out to him more than once. The knife, repeated Elias, sinking away from her, as it were, with closed eyes and knotted brows. The knife. The knife. She could get nothing more out of him. All through the Sunday eager crowds from Koopstad moved on before the villa, lying mysterious with its awful secret, its closed blinds gleaming white beneath the fresh spring sunshine. It was known that the murderer had not been removed, he was being watched in the house. The juge d'instruction was to examine him on Monday morning, at the same hour which had originally been set apart for the legal inquiry into his mental condition. People smiled to each other when this fact was noted. He has supplied new material, if any was wanting, they said. There is not much doubt now but that he will be considered insane. He is a dangerous maniac and must be strictly confined in a madhouse. It is evidently a case of homicidal mania, said all the doctors but one. I don't believe a word of it, said Dr. Pillenaar. The police authorities meanwhile were quietly building up the case of the man they had got. The lawyer denied his guilt, of course. He being a lawyer, this was to be expected. But everything seemed as plain as a pikestaff, none the less. There was but one difficulty. The dead man's coachman, who had returned to his station by the front door after Alers had entered the house, swore to having seen his master's shadow move rapidly across the blind a few moments subsequent to what he, Chris, believed to have been the lawyer's departure. For, while the carriage was waiting, a gentleman had issued from the villa, and it was not till this gentleman had disappeared out of sight that the coachman had seen the shadow. But, then, Chris had at first declared to all who would hear him that the dead merchant had also come out at the front door and had ordered him to drive home. Chris had done so and had heard the defunct move restlessly in the carriage. "It was his ghost," explained Chris. The public prosecutor did not accept the explanation. Who, then, was this gentleman who had come to the house and gone away? The coachman could not identify Alers because of the dark and the heavy mist. But that was of less importance. The police were quite willing to admit that Chris might have seen the lawyer depart. What they could not attach so much importance to, in the face of all the other evidence, was the exact moment of the appearance of the shadow on the blind. John repeated with vehemence that he had never admitted no one but the lawyer. More portraits of Elias than ever were sold on that beautiful Sunday afternoon. Copies were even bought by some of the young ladies who had so sincerely regretted that the prisoned eagle would not pair. The higher classes of Koopstad, the cousins, were reproachful, regretful, annoyed and ashamed. The whole disgraceful scandal ought to have been avoided. Hendrik Lossell did not belong to a class of men of business which had a right to speculate and become bankrupt. And Elias, who, whether idiot or criminal maniac or what not, had always been, and probably still was, the richest man in Koopstad, ought to have been prevented from bringing such public ignominy on his name, on his family, and on the class to which he belonged none the less, but rather a little the more, because he was such an utter fool. Late in the evening, the richest man in Koopstad roused himself and said that he wanted his brother Hubert to be sent for to come and see him next morning, before the other gentlemen came. End of chapter 51. Chapter 52 of God's Fool by Maarten MAARTENS. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. The Resurrection and the Life. The fool sat in his room, by the fireside, with his hands in his lap. His eyes were closed. God had closed them. And in the deep darkness of his soul lay light made manifest, the beatific vision of that which is not, and therefore is eternal. Johanna went up to him and touched his hand. "Mein Heer," she said, "Meneer Hubert is come." Then she turned to leave the two brothers together. "He does not seem to understand," she declared to Hubert Lossell in passing. "But, Meneer Hubert, he knows nothing of the murder, although he says he did it. Ask him. You will find he did not even know about the knife." Then she broke down and drew her black silk apron across her face. Hubert had noticed how white and wretched she looked. All her comeliness seemed suddenly to have forsaken her in these last 2 days. "Hubert," said Elias, speaking in a whisper, barely audible, for he was unable to modulate it. "Listen, Hubert. Are we alone?" Hubert Lossell came close to his brother and answered, "Yes." "Quite alone? Are you sure? Is the door shut?" "Yes. What is it?" "Hubert, why did you take the knife?" In that moment, for the first time in his life, Hubert Lossell rejoiced with a rush of fierce rejoicing over the blindness he himself had inflicted. "Listen, Hubert," Elias went on, speaking fast and louder, though he still believed himself to be whispering. "I remember now. I remember all about it. I mean, not quite all, but enough. There was somebody in the room when they struck me. Was it you or Hendrik struck me? I didn't know you were there then. I can't understand why I didn't know. But before I woke, after the blow, I felt you were there. Were you gone, Hubert, when I struck Hendrik? I don't remember you then. But when Johanna spoke about the knife, I suddenly remembered that you had been there that evening. Then it must have been you that used the knife, Hubert. Johanna says it was the knife killed Hendrik. But she doesn't know, because I killed him too. Why did you kill Hendrik, Hubert, as well as I?" In a moment the whole confused crowd of conflicting circumstances fell into orderly places, and their harmony stood revealed to Hubert's mind. The puzzle was complete. Once more he saw himself hurrying back from Amsterdam, having just caught the earlier train, as it was steaming out of the station. Again he heard the incessant, exasperating "Volderdoeszonen, Volderdoeszonen" of the thumping carriages all the way down to Koopstad. He had noticed, upon reaching his destination, that it was still early, not yet 7:30, and he decided first to run out to the villa, to obtain from Elias, before he was put to bed, the so necessary information as to the genuineness of the documents which had been used at Amsterdam. He must be certain of this matter first, before he could demand a final explanation of Hendrik. On the way out he had met a carriage. Doubtless it was Hendrik's, returning with the notary. He had not recognized it in the mist. When he reached the house he had let himself in with a latchkey, which he had constantly used after his return from China. Old Hendrik had had it, and having seen light in Elias's sitting room he had run up thither. But on the landing he had paused, hearing voices, Hendrik's and yes, Alers's. He had slipped into the adjoining bedroom and listened. Thus he had surprised these two in the midst of their quarrel. He had heard their recriminations, and had soon discovered all the infamy of the forged power of attorney. Hendrik had the document with him, and Hubert had soon heard him declare that, all other means having failed, he was now willing to use it. Furthermore, he had heard him affirm that he was going straight to his appointment with Lankater, so that, in another hour at the most, the still obtainable shares would be his. All this Hubert had heard, as he stood listening in the darkness. But he had not been aware that, when Thomas left the house, the lawyer had taken away the forged deed with him in his pocket. Immediately after Alers's departure, Hubert had burst in upon his two brothers. He had found Elias lying motionless in his chair on one side of the fire, and Hendrik sitting pensively opposite. He now understood that Alers, on first entering, or perhaps Hendrik, more probably Alers, must have struck down the fool with some blunt object, not to hurt, but to silence him and to have him out of the way. The interview between the twins had been short but very violent. Elias must have recovered consciousness, or semi-consciousness, towards its close. Hubert had furiously upbraided his brother, and reproached him with the impending ruin of the house. Hendrik had answered scornfully, had laughed at the other, at his impotent rage, at his got-up tale of the tobacco plot and its consequences, at the prospects of misery and misfortune where success was at last within reach. "I am going to be rich in spite of your envious resolve to keep me poor," he had said. "I am off to Lankater's notary at this moment, and to-morrow, when I am at last head of the house, little Hubert, we can continue this pleasant conversation. Ta-ta!" He had run round by the window to depart. It was this shadow which Chris must have seen. But, suddenly bethinking himself, he had sat down in his former seat for one moment, to fasten a bootlace. It was then that Hubert had stabbed him in the back, with a knife which he had caught up from a dumb waiter standing ready in the passage. He had stabbed him in the name of justice, in the service of red-handed, right-handed Nemesis, as an executioner, an avenger, a knight of the cross. With one terrified glance at his victim, sitting bent double, the head sunk forward on the knees, and at Elias opposite, apparently senseless, Hubert had fled from the room, down the deserted staircase, out of the house. He had understood immediately, even before he struck the blow, that suspicion would fall upon Alers. No one knew of his, Hubert's, presence at the villa. He must get back to the town in time to reach home as if he had just arrived by the 8 o'clock train. His acquaintance in Amsterdam could testify to his having quitted him too late to catch the preceding one. There had been only one way of rendering this possible. It was past 8 already. He had jumped into Hendrik's carriage under cover of the mist. That the tone of their voices was very similar is known to all Koopstad. And, having opened and shut the door once or twice, so that the coachman might get tired of looking round, he had slipped out, still under cover of the mist, as soon as the tram-rails were reached, and, catching a tram a few moments later, he had found himself at home as soon as, if not sooner than, Alers. Most of this he had of course known before, though he had had no idea that Elias had been rendered unconscious, but had yet recovered such senses, or part of such senses, as he possessed in time to vaguely realize his second brother's presence in the room. Of Alers's having been there, Elias evidently was not aware, as was only natural, for Alers was not a person whose approach he could have gathered from any other indications than actual information. Hubert's coming he had felt, as that of all people whom he specially loved. But it was evident that, as he regained a fuller consciousness, he had remembered nothing but the insult, the injury he had received, and, springing forward, he must have struck what was already the corpse of Hendrik Lossell. This Hubert now understood, and it explained to him how Elias could have so firmly believed himself to be the murderer. It also explained how Elias, knowing nothing of Alers, but remembering, when the wound with the knife was first mentioned, that Hubert had been in the room with him and Hendrik, had learned to comprehend that the wound with the knife must be Hubert's. Hubert was happy. No, he was not happy. Hubert was content to know that the police authorities thought otherwise. It was right that Alers should bear the blame of the murder. For, in reality, Alers was the guilty man. He had slain Hendrik morally. He alone had rendered this physical killing expedient, unavoidable. And it was right, it was just, that, being the intellectual cause of Hendrik's death, he should be punished for it, and he alone. "Why did you kill Hendrik, Hubert?" repeated Elias after a long pause. "As well as I." Hubert did not answer him. "I want to know," the fool continued piteously. "I do so want to know, because I cannot understand. I have been thinking about it day and night, it seems for ages, and my head gets so tired, and then I forget what I'd thought. You didn't do it because he struck you. Did you do it, Hubert? Did you do it because Hendrik wanted to do harm to Volderdoes Zonen?" Hubert stood, away from his stepbrother, by the window. He could not approach to give answer. He would not have known what answer to give. Doubtless Volderdoes Zonen had been his first thought. But he had not forgotten his children, whose fortunes were so intimately connected with the welfare of the firm. He desired nothing better than to work for them, and for Elias, and Margaret. The great house must be uplifted out of this slough of destruction. It must be restored to its former repose and solidity, and the blot on its integrity must be wiped out in the course of the spotless years. That would be his mission in future. The name of Lossell must be as honoured in the future as it had ever been in the past. Koopstad honour. Commercial honour. The honour, not of even balances, which would mean bankruptcy and are to be avoided, but of heavy balances, on the right side, the winning side, that is. Big surpluses, in a word, for these are the only balances to which a wise merchant need pay attention, just as the only scales of which justice is careful are her scales of increasing costs. Thank God thou art only a fool, Elias, and of such, in this wide world of Koopstad, is the kingdom of heaven. To restore the greatness of his name before the world, that henceforth would be Hubert Lossell's work. He would do it with all his strength of heart and brain. He would bring up his sons to aid him and to work as hard and as honestly as he did. Until they took their share of the labour he must work alone. It was his destiny. He accepted it. And he thought of his dead father. The money was Elias's. It would be more than ever Elias's now, after Hendrik's insolvency, for Hendrik's share in the business would have to be bought up, and his debts would have to be paid with the rich stepbrother's money. This was unavoidable, and doubtless the judges would authorize the necessary steps. But all must be open and above board henceforth, and the money must remain Elias's, according to old Volderdoes's will. Hubert would always be a poor man. He could not help it. More than ever, Elias was head of the firm. But how could he have explained to this unfortunate why it had been his duty to remove Hendrik? Even had he wished to do so, the thing would have remained manifestly impossible. He must simply deny Elias's charge, which not a soul would believe. Everyone knew that Hubert Lossell had been away at Amsterdam, and on his return had gone home straight from the station. And so he was dumb. "I believe," continued Elias, "that you did it for Volderdoes Zonen, because you told me before that Hendrik was harming them. That was very wicked of him. But I am sure also that it was very wicked of you to kill him. Don't be angry with me for saying so, Hubert. It was far more wicked of me because I only did it for myself." He waited a moment, overpowered by the recollection of his own guilt. "It was very, very wicked," he went on presently. "Johanna says I didn't kill him because someone else killed him first. She doesn't know it was you. She says two people can't kill the same person, one after the other. But I know that is wrong, and so I told her, because Pilate killed Christ and then the Jews killed him afterwards. Mother Margaretha told me so. And of course it's true. I can love Mother Margaretha, and you can love her, and ever so many more people can. And you can hate Hendrik, and I can hate him, though it's very wrong. I don't hate him now, it was only for a minute. I don't know much about what Johanna calls death, but I know about killing people by hating them till they don't go on being, and Johanna says they're dead. Christ says we mustn't hate anybody, and that's what they did to Christ. It's the most dreadful wickedness possible. Oh, Hubert!" His face contracted with anxiety. "There is one thing I want to know terribly. I want to ask Mother Margaretha. I must know it. It is whether God has ever forgiven Pilate, though everybody here on earth seems so angry with him still." Hubert stood motionless by the window, his eyes fixed on Elias's. "Ah, well," said the blind man wearily, "you must find out and tell me. Mother Margaretha must send and tell me if she mayn't come herself, in that place where Johanna says they will put me, and Johanna says she mayn't. Please remember to ask her about it. Please do." "Johanna says," he began again, "that they never punish more than one person for killing a dead man. I don't understand. It seems so strange, but I am very glad it should be so. And so, of course, they must punish me because I was wickeder than you. And besides, there is Mother Margaretha and the children, Jack and Winnie and the babies, and Volderdoes Zonen. I have thought of it all, but my head is very tired. It won't matter much to me whether I live here or in another house. Johanna says I shall live in another house, not so nice, but I shan't notice. And oh, Hubert, I hope you will be sorry. It was very, very wicked, and I shall be sorry too." At last Hubert broke loose from the chain which had held him fettered to his silence. He ran up to Elias and caught his hand, but it was only to spell on its palm, "It wasn't us, Elias. It was another man." Elias disengaged his fingers and rose from his seat. "Don't, Hubert," he said. "You hurt me. I know it was you as well as me. If it was other people too, so much the worse for them. I don't know anything about other people, but it was you who came yesterday and killed him. I shall not tell anything about your coming to anybody. Never. and Johanna declares they are always satisfied with one man. But I shall say, gentlemen, it was I who killed my brother. I was angry with him for striking me. You must lock me up. And you must live to be very, very sorry, Hubert, and, when you think of me, you will know that I am sorry too. I am sure we may ask God to forgive us. I thought not at first, but I am sure now that we may always do that." Elias stood erect by the fireplace. At his feet lay the hideous stain on the carpet, of which he was utterly unconscious. At that moment he saw only the brother who had wronged him in his childhood, whose face he had never beheld since it had outgrown its early infancy. His eyes were blazing with light. "The gentleman will be waiting for us," he said. "Dear, dear Hubert, you must be very sorry. And you must be very good to Volderdoes Zonen. I have been thinking, if we are very sorry, and if we pray to God very, very often, always, and I feel sure they will let me pray over there, that at last, perhaps, He may forgive us and make Hendrik not dead again, as the Lord Christ was made. And then Hendrik will be good, and we shall not have killed him. Oh no, I mean, we shall have killed him, but he will not be killed. And he will come back to Cornelia, as Mother Margaretha, who Johanna said was dead, came back to me. It will all come right, only we must pray very much. We must pray very much, dear brother. I wish you had spoken to me and told me you had done it and were sorry." He threw back the long curls from his face and straightened his stately figure, and then, resuming immediately, unconsciously, the slight stoop of his blindness, he walked across the room with even step, and, opening the door and softly closing it behind him, went down to meet his judges. Hubert, left alone in the room, alone with that stain upon the carpet, stared stupidly for one moment at the door which had just sunk back into its place again. Then he sprang forward with a cry which no one but himself could hear. "Elias!" The end. End of God's Fool, a Koopstad story. Written by Maarten MAARTENS, first published in 1892. Read for LibriVox.org by Anna Simon. 2016 in Nijmegen.